way down upon the Wabash. Such a land was never known. If Adam had crossed over it, this soil he'd surely own. And he'd say it was a garden that he lived in as a boy. Straightway pronounce it Eden, this state of Illinois. So move your family westward, bring all your girls and boys. Cross the Shawnee Ferry to the state of Illinois. Welcome, folks. This is the Grapevine Harvest, and I'm your host, Dan Keding. And this evening we have a real special guest, a good friend of mine, a wonderful storyteller from Southern Illinois, and her name is Marilyn Kinsella. And Marilyn, it's great to have you here on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I think what I'd like to talk about with you today is not just your storytelling, because I've known you as a storyteller for a long time, and I've always been impressed with your work, but also I want to talk to you about the types of stories, and also you're moving and shaking in the storytelling mode. So like Marilyn Kinsella, the earthquake of Southern Illinois. You know. So.
I find no fault with that, Dan.
Oh, no. When did you first get interested in storytelling?
Actually, I can probably pinpoint the day and time. It was in May of 1981. I was a teacher at the time, and somebody said, go listen to these storytellers. I had never heard of this group. They were called the Folk Tellers. Have you heard of that group? Yeah. And it was like a lightning bolt came down and said, this is what you want to be. And it's been a journey since then, taken me all four corners of the United States and right back here to Southern Illinois. So.
Well, I know we've had you here in Central Illinois, here at Springfield. You've been at the Clayville Music and Storytelling Festival. You've been at the New Salem Storytelling Festival. You've played, haven't you played also out at the Lincoln Memorial Gardens?
Right.
So you've played a lot around here. Your name is familiar to people.
Right. Springfield's been really good to me with storytelling.
And we've had you at Prairie Grapevine for concerts.
Right.
Yes. One of the things I wanted to ask, and this is going to put you on the spot, what was the first story they told that really zonked you?
Oh, when I heard the folk tellers, I guess the thing that I heard them tell was King at the Door.
Oh, King at the Door, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
and they do it in tandem.
Mm-hmm.
And just watching the two of them up there and telling a story, and of course I had this mentality that I'm going to have to memorize, you know, and being a right-brained person myself, how would I ever do that? And tried myself that summer to do my storytelling on my own and fell flat on my face, just flat on my face. But luckily that August I went to a workshop in Jonesboro, Tennessee, where, as you know, is the Knapp's office, and Jackie Torrance was my first teacher.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
That's great.
And, oh, she taught me all kinds of wonderful things. But one of the main things that everybody asks me about is we try not to memorize words. Mm-hmm. We try to memorize pictures and trust ourselves to tell about those pictures. And that was my biggest hurdle, mm-hmm. getting, you know, to do that. And being with Jackie Torrance that weekend taught me all kinds of wonderful things. And, you know, I went home that week with 10 stories I could tell.
Wow, that's great. That's
and
wonderful. Yeah.
Came back on the bus telling stories, and came back to my school and told stories, and I told and I told and I told, and mainly folk tales at that point.
Mm-hmm.
You know, folk tales are great because they've been around for centuries. You don't really have to do any work with characterization. Everything is there for you. You just need to pull in from different sources and just tell it in your own way. And that's why I found folk tales so appealing at first. But after I got into it, I kind of discovered that, you know, I have things in my own background that I could tell stories about too. And that was another whole door opening up for me.
Mm-hmm.
I heard Michael Cotter.
Of course.
Right, and up in Minnesota. And everybody had talked about Michael, but I wasn't quite so sure. And when I heard him tell his stories, I knew I had to start telling things about growing up in Southern Illinois. So maybe I'd like to share one of the stories, because it kind of tells a little bit about my storytelling and where I came from. I call this story Making Music. Now, when I went down to Jonesboro, Tennessee, and was with Jackie Torrance for that weekend, she said something to me that I'll never forget. She said, Marilyn, use your talents. Well, Dan, you know I can't sing. I can't play any musical instrument. I can't juggle like I've seen other storytellers do. I didn't really quite know what she was talking about, using my talents. But that kind of leads me into this story. You see, I'm from Fairview Heights, Illinois. I've lived there all my life. And when I was growing up, I was raised in a house that was built by my grandpa at the turn of the century. But my grandmother had died before I was born, so I never got to know her. And yet, in a way, I did get to know her, because she was an artist. And all around our house were the beautiful paintings and oils and china that she had painted. My mother used to tell me stories about her. And then as you went into the parlor, there was a beautiful baby grand piano. She was also a pianist. My mom would say that for 2 hours every day she sat there at that piano and played all the wonderful classics and modern songs of the day. I kind of thought, since my middle name was Adele and her name was Adele, that maybe it was going to be my job to take over her place. Sometimes when my mom was out of the room, I would open up that piano and plunk down on one of the keys, let that sound reverberate around the house. I knew I was going to take her place at that piano bench. Finally, when I was 10 years old, my mom gave me piano lessons. And for 2 years, I struggled through piano lessons. My little fingers would have to stretch in order to reach those keys. Up and down they would go, playing all the scales. And worst of all was that metronome, ticking and tocking back and forth, as if to say, "You've got 10 more minutes. You've got 10 more minutes." And if there just happened to be just a little lull in my playing, I could hear my mom out in the kitchen saying, "You've got 10 more minutes." Well, after 2 years of begging and pleading, my piano lessons stopped. And I know I felt kind of bad about that because, well, I felt there was something musical inside. But you know, I discovered that storytelling is my music. You know, I look on every story that I tell as a piece of music. And sometimes I tell my stories forte and sometimes pianissimo. I look upon every word as a note with its own intrinsic value and sound. And sometimes when I tell a story just right, I'm able to reach out and strike a chord in my audience. And you know, I don't mind practicing one bit. Now, this whole idea of my storytelling and my music wasn't quite my own. You see, it happened one day several years ago. I was asked to tell stories in East St. Louis. Now, East St. Louis doesn't have the best of reputations, but I knew I was going to be safe enough. They were going to meet me at the gate, escort me in, and I was going to be telling to a multitude of campers. Well, it was a hot, hot June day. And as I sat under that tree and started to tell my stories, oh, their eyes got big and wide with excitement. I kind of felt like maybe I was giving just a little bit back to that community. Well, I was telling those stories when suddenly those words of Jackie Torrance started to come back to me. Use your talents. And suddenly I knew what she meant. And so I started to tell Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, and they roar their terrible roars and roll their terrible eyes and show their terrible claws. There was that talent. Drove Sister Mary Constance crazy in the first grade. And then I was on a roll. So I started to tell Brer Possum and Brer Snake, and for the first time, Brer Snake kind of emerged. They all kind of sat back and watched. Well, now I was on a real roll. So I started to tell, that story by Mercer Mayer, Liza Lou and the Yellow Belly Swamp. And in that story, she has to trick the witch into thinking that she really is carrying a baby in her arms, when all along it's just a bundle of laundry. So she takes that bundle of laundry and she makes it sound just like a baby cry. And there it was, Girl Scouts in the 7th grade, that little talent. Well, finally my stories were over, and I got up to leave, and this little camper followed me out to the parking lot. And she said, "Now you tell me how you did that." And you know, Dan, kids are always asking you, how do you memorize a story, or how do you do the character voices? But I didn't answer her, but I asked her, how do I do what? And she said, you know, how do you make music with your words? Well, it was one of those golden moments when you wish you had a tape recorder or a picture or something to celebrate this moment. But all I have is the memory. And I realize now something. You know, I realize I'm never going to make music on a piano like my grandmother did, nor on the violin like my mother does. But I can make music. I can make music with my words.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful story.
Thank you.
I think personal stories tell so much about the person because there's a revelation there of who the teller is. I tell a lot of traditional stories, and lately, within the last 3 or 4 years, I've been telling stories about my grandmother. And all of a sudden, people are coming up to me saying, well, we always liked the traditional stories, but now we know who you are. Because for some reason, the traditional stories, they're part of all of our legacies. Right. And the personal stories are your legacy and my legacy that we share with others.
But if you look at your whole collection of stories that you tell, I think that tells a lot about yourself, too.
That worries me because I do so many gruesome stories.
Old Grizzly Beard, I think.
Oh, Grizzly Beard, yeah. Yeah. I was thinking when you were talking about the folk tellers, the first person that really influenced me as a storyteller was a folk singer. He's an Englishman, and if I'm not mistaken, Barbara learned Mr. Fox from him also, and I learned it from him. His name's Tony Behrens, and he lives on the East Coast now. And I heard him in the mid-'70s, and I heard Mr. Fox and went, wow. I went out to my local library, and that's the best place to find all those books, and found a half-dozen versions of Mr. Fox, Xeroxed them all, which is probably against the law, went home and put together my own version of Mr. Fox because I wanted it to be unique. And I remember how proud I was the first time I told that. And that must have been about 75, 76.
And you know, when storytellers just start out, a lot of it is imitating.
Oh, sure.
And that's fine. That's how I think we all got started is, oh, I kind of like the way she told that story. I'm going to tell the story the way she told that story.
Right.
But you soon discover that you can never tell the story like somebody else told it. So you may as well just go ahead and take it and tell it in your own way. Because if you try to imitate, it's like baking a cake, I guess, from a box instead of putting all the ingredients together yourself. Yeah, sure, it comes out all right, but everybody knows it's not yours.
That's right, that's right. Well, I know that you've been not only featured in this area, but you've been featured at the Illinois Storytelling Festival and so many
We're
other.
both going there this year.
Both going to be there. It's going to be a lot of fun this year. I'm
10
excited.
years on all Illinois tellers. That's going to be fun.
That's going to be really great. All our friends are going to be there.
End of July, right?
Right, the last weekend in July. But the other thing that fascinates me about you is you also find time to, I don't know how, but you also find time as an organizer, someone who's very, very influential in your community, not just as a teller. Oh, by the way, I should tell you, I was tracing you down today on the phone, and I called the Fairview Heights Library, because I couldn't remember which library you worked at. And so I said, I'd like to speak to Marilyn Kinsella. And she said, oh, Marilyn Kinsella doesn't work here. You know, she's a very famous storyteller. So I thought you'd appreciate that. But you also are organizing storytelling events, festivals, workshops. If I'm not mistaken, you were one of the founders of the Riverwind Guild.
Riverwind Storytellers.
Tell us a little bit about
that. Back in about 1982, the storytellers got together at the Knapp's Festival from Southern Illinois and decided this is really a good thing. We need to bring this back to Illinois. and that's where Riverwind started. And since that time, I've been president for about 5 years now. We have a big workshop once a year, and that workshop is just around the corner. It's going to be the first weekend in March, and if anybody was interested, I'm sure they could contact you,
Sure.
and you send them on to me. We're having David Novak this year, by the way.
He's wonderful.
So we do that once a year. We have a festival called the Land of Goshen Storytelling Festival. You were featured one year on that
That's
one.
right. Great festival.
They sound like they'd like to go on with this in Edwardsville, so
Oh, that's great.
something else to do. And of course, being a part of the Riverwind Storytellers, we meet once a month, share stories, break bread together, and just relax and really good friends. I think storytelling somehow cements this friendship. I'm not sure how that works, but
It's amazing because I've been in the folk music world for most of my adult life, all of my adult life, and the storytelling world almost as long, but there's nothing like a group of storytellers. I mean, there's a camaraderie and a warmth that's just
Right.
amazing. Let me ask you about some of the personal stories you've been telling about family members. I know that at the Land of Goshen Festival, it must have been almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, you told this fantastic story about your grandfather. And I just sat in the back of the room and I went, wow, that's great, you know? And I came back and I said, God, you got to hear Marilyn's new stories. I mean, they're just amazing. His grandfather story, I'm just sitting in the back of the room weeping, you know? And how did you did you feel vulnerable the first time you told a story about yourself and
Yes.
about your family? I mean, were you nervous about it? Was it like, why would anybody be interested in my family and my
family
story?
stories, right. Again, I have to go back to Michael Cotter and sitting down with him and him telling me that it's just that heart-to-heart experience that everybody knows about that appeals to everybody. It's not somebody who has traveled around the world. We don't really connect with somebody like that. We connect with somebody whose experiences are very much like our own. And just finding the story that's there is probably the thing that's the most difficult. The people are there, the setting is there. Sometimes you have to find the story that goes with it. And that story you were talking about is called Call of the Mourning Dove.
Right, it's a great
And
story.
that's going to be my next tape, is going to be called The Call of the Mourning Dove. And I hope to tell stories on it that are my grandmother's stories, my grandfather's stories. And something very special happened on August 19th, which was my birthday this year. My last story came to me. I was working at the library in Edwardsville, and suddenly all of these things about my grandparents that lived in East St. Louis just came together, and there was the story. I'd like to share that with
That'd
you.
be
if we
great.
have
Tell
time.
us.
I call this story Sunday Visits. I hated Sunday afternoons. Every Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock, my dad would haul us all together and take us down to East St. Louis to visit my grandparents. Now, back in the 50s, East St. Louis was the all-American city. And my grandfather owned a rather nice, comfortable home there. It was just my grandpa. Don't get me wrong, my grandpa was a wonderful man. He just didn't relate very well to a feisty 7-year-old. And I was a feisty child. My image of my grandpa is him sitting down in front of his old Philco black and white set with his good ear cupped to the speaker. I would come in and give him his kiss on his whiskered cheek, and out the back door I'd go. The house was so depressing on the inside. It was full of dark shadows pierced with dusty beams of light. And the minute you walked in, your nose was assaulted with the smells of Palmolive soap and Bengay and stale Muriel cigars. Now, the house wasn't always like that. You know, just 2 years before, the house was full of light and lavender. That's when my grandma was there. Her name was Sarah Dixon. She had the only little bit of English in my ancestry. She was the type that you would call your quintessential grandma. Silver hair pulled back at the base of her neck, crystalline blue eyes that seemed to reflect a rainbow. And, you know, she brought a little bit of that English into the house with her. All the furniture was covered with doilies, and every day at 4 o'clock there'd be a spot of tea. But I guess most of all it was her garden, a beautiful English garden in the back. Now, entering into this garden was like entering into a whole other world. First of all, you entered through this arched trellis way, where red roses kind of winded its way up and around. As you walked through, there were some irregular stepping stones, and we would walk down that path, and to your right there would be some black-faced pansies, and to your left pools of sweet alyssum. Standing like sentinel up against the white picket fence were red and pink hollyhocks. In the middle of that garden there was a bird bath, and the birds would fly from that bath to the rows of multicolored birdhouses that my grandfather had built. Now, at the four corners of the garden, there were tall metal poles, and at the top of those poles were the wooden airplanes that my grandpa also had fashioned. Their propellers would kind of lazily spin in the breeze. But my favorite part of the garden was the far corner. There was this huge, just huge weeping willow tree. Its branches hung down like a shaggy dog's mane. Now inside, that was my secret hiding place. I could see out, but nobody could see in. I'd set up my make-believe village when I would go there, and sometimes I'd see my grandma out in the garden working. Approximately 4 o'clock, though, she would come over and she'd say, "Would you like to come in for a spot of tea now?" Well, one day while she was working out there, she broke her trowel and she gave it to me. Now, this was a real treasure because now I could dig and bury. And dig and bury I did. Anything I could find around the house, some bended spoons or maybe some bottle caps. One time I found this really neat little silver thimble, and I buried it. The next week, though, my grandma said, "You haven't seen my silver thimble around, have you?" And I just kind of shrugged my shoulders. I didn't know what she was talking about. But my face must have turned beet red because she said, "Well, if you should happen to find it buried somewhere, you will make sure it gets back where it belongs." And the next Saturday, it was back where it belonged. Now, there were, of course, sometimes when we couldn't go out there. Sometimes when it was raining, we'd have to spend our time on the front porch. My grandpa had built this kind of a bench swing, and we would sit there and swing back and forth and watch the cars go past, looking for all the world like motorboats on those rain-swelled streets. More often than not, there was a train that passed by. Their house was right next to the railroad tracks, and I thought that was the neatest thing in the whole world because we would sit there and we'd count the cars as they passed. I still love the sound of old trains at night. But after a while, things got a little boring, so she'd say, "I'll be right back." And she'd go back and she'd come out with a little box, an old cigar box. And inside, there'd be a little Bible and some holy cards and a tiny little music box. She'd take that box and she'd kind of twist it, and we'd let that sound of those musical bells fill the front porch. She'd say, "That's the Blue Danube." I didn't know what a Blue Danube was. I just knew I loved the sound of those tiny bells and the feel of my grandma's soft puff-a-lump body. One day, though, my dad said that Grandma wouldn't be there anymore. "Why?" I said. "Well, she's sick." "Well, I should go visit her if she's in the hospital." "No, you can't do that." What I discovered at that time was that my grandmother was suffering from the first stages of Alzheimer's disease. Of course, back in the 50s, there was no word for that. And when she started to act a little strange, well, they put her in a mental institution. And for the last 2 years of her life, that's where she lived. And it was during that time that those visits to my grandpa started to go downhill a little bit. I really dreaded having to go. Finally, one day, my dad said that Grandma had passed on. And I felt so bad because, I wasn't even able to say goodbye to her. Well, things went on, and I kept on going down for my Sunday visits. One time I got down there and there was such a bad thunderstorm, I knew I was going to be stuck inside. I kind of sat around and read the newspaper about 7 times over and tried to get interested in their Sunday news programs. Finally, I decided to go around for a snoop. I was a great snoop back then. And I got to the back porch where they had all their old junk, especially this neat old cupboard full of stuff, and I could see at the very top that cigar box. Well, I went up and I got the cigar box down and I opened it up. There was the tiny Bible. I was able to read some of it now myself, and the holy cards that my father had won when he was in school. I picked up that little music box and I twisted it and I let those bells fill up the back porch. Just then I could see my grandpa's shadow up against the kitchen. He had his good ear cupped to the back porch. "The Blue Danube," he said. "Sarah and I used to dance to the Blue Danube when we were young." I remember thinking, my grandpa, young, dancing. But immediately I closed it up and I put the box away. But the next Sunday when I came, oh, it was a beautiful Sunday. And I went right into the backyard and to that favorite tree. As I sat down, I felt something hard, and when I looked around, there was that box. I knew my grandpa had left it for me, even though he never said a word about it. I opened it up, and there were all those treasures inside. I took that music box, I twisted it, I let the sound fill up my secret space. And I thought of William and Sarah dancing to the Blue Danube. And I wish, you know, I had those things to share with you today, but I buried them, along with all those other childhood memories. But that's okay, because, you know, sometimes on those rainy Sunday afternoons, I'm able to dig through that memory box of mine and wonder at the many treasures I hold.
It's a beautiful story.
Thank
you for sharing that with us. It seems so wonderful to suddenly get a glimpse of these two people that I don't know, and to see them through your eyes, and how wonderful and how alive they come because of your stories. And it's amazing that those of us who tell stories are giving those characters, whether they be Grandpa and Grandma, who are real people, or whether they be Brer Rabbit, we give them an immortality that they can't possibly have without us. And it's wonderful that you're continuing to do that. Well, we're going to say goodbye in a few minutes now, and we've had a wonderful time here at the Grapevine Harvest. This is Marilyn Kinsella, and she will be at the Illinois Storytelling Festival this year, along with many Illinois storytellers. That's going to be the last full weekend of July, and that's up in Spring Grove, Illinois. It's one of the finest festivals in the country. And look for Marilyn's name. She plays around a lot around here. Yeah, that's a bad thing. I should say plays around. I don't know. But she performs. And Prairie Grapevine will be having some concerts. In March, Larry Penn will be there on the first Saturday. And in April, Gail Ross, this great storyteller, Cherokee storyteller from Texas. She's going to be coming up and doing a performance for Prairie Grapevine. So come on out and see us on the first Saturday. It's held at Lincoln Land Community College. And on behalf of all the people with Prairie Grapevine, I want to thank Marilyn, and I want to thank you for tuning us in and giving us a listen. And tune us in again to listen to the stories and the songs that are going to come to you through the folk music and the storytelling of the people of our area. Thanks very much. I'm Dan Keding.